So good morning everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, dear colleagues, a warm welcome to this very special event here at the Conduit in central London. My name's Richard Jones, Editorial Director at Devex, and we're the media platform for the global development community. So here today, together with our co-hosts, the UK Space Agency, Space Applications Catapult, UNITAR and the CommonSensing Consortium partners, we're delighted to welcome our in-person audience and our viewers from across the globe joining us on live stream for Turning the Tide, Building a Climate Resilient Future. And for anyone tweeting today, I always say, well, please be nice, first of all, and please also tag the handle @Devex and the hashtag Turning the Tide. Now, at Devex, climate resilience is an issue that we've been following closely this year in our digital content series, Turning the Tide. And this is a global conversation on climate change and specifically honing in on small island developing states, or SIDS. So this event is a live extension of that series, and I'd encourage you all to visit turningthetide.devex.com and stay tuned for more stories and on-the-ground reporting over the coming year. Today you'll hear from a wide range of experts, all sat on our front row, as we dig down into ways in which resilience towards climate change can be improved, how responses can be better tailored more specifically for small island developing states, what the future of climate resilience looks like, as well as how CommonSensing, which is a UK Space Agency funded project that's part of the UKSA's 5-year, £152 million international partnerships programme. So how these projects are helping to mitigate the devastating impacts of climate change and extreme weather events in the Pacific region and in other regions around the world. So here we are, in a week where Extinction Rebellion have taken to the streets of Westminster, and just a few weeks on from the climate change summit in New York during the UN General Assembly. Some mixed reactions from that one in the green room earlier. And despite, or perhaps because of, its detractors and its deniers, I think the issue of climate change has seldom been more prominent in the daily news cycle and consciousness of the general public. But beyond the diatribe and the debate, there are human stories from the front lines of climate change, lives and livelihoods are being affected, and small island developing states finding themselves playing out a cautionary tale to the rest of the world on the dangers of inaction. Even so, at local, community, national, and international level, there are considerable efforts underway in areas such as climate finance, food security, disaster risk reduction, and resilience, to name just a few. So today, I'm hopeful that we can highlight some perspectives on the role of partnerships, awareness raising, and cross-sector collaboration at the intersection of technology, innovation, and global development, and really look at how we as a broad community can move the needle on progress. So I look forward to a productive session that we have ahead of us this morning. And without further ado, we'd like to invite Dr. Graham Turnock, CEO at the UK Space Agency, to give us his opening remarks. Graham.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I'd obviously like to focus my remarks on the IPP programme and in particular the CommonSensing project, but I think as Richard says, it's a very important week to reflect on climate change more generally and from my perspective what space can do in that area. And there is a very big effort in space on climate change. Earth-observing satellites have the potential to enable us to understand and respond to and better manage human impact on the environment. It's a huge effort going on through the Copernicus programme, but we as the UK Space Agency are involved in other projects, working with partners such as the French Space Agency in this area. And more generally, I think space has great potential to enable more efficient and less energy-intensive ways of working just by its very nature. So that's the wider context. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the IPP programme. So the UK Space Agency itself has a broad remit to lead the UK government's civil space policy, manages UK's space regulation, and it's an active member of the European Space Agency's missions, contributing to cutting-edge science and technology. But most importantly, we are firmly focused on using data from space, as I've just said, to make life better here on Earth. And satellite applications are increasingly being used by smarter governments around the world in recognition of the fundamental impact that they have on all our lives on a daily basis. It's here where the UK space sector's research and innovation strengths are able to play a significant role by demonstrating the variety of ways in which they can be used to save money and lives, deliver innovative services, and enable more effective policy decisions. So, the UK Space Agency's International Partnerships Programme, or IPP, was therefore designed to utilise, as I've said, the UK space sector's capabilities in data services to make a practical and sustainable impact on the ground. Most importantly, as Richard's mentioned, by building trusted partnerships in emerging and developing economies around the world. We've so far had 2 competitions in 2016 and 2017, and through those we've generated 33 grant-funded projects in 44 countries across Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, to the tune of £128 million so far. And as a result, this programme is without doubt the world's largest space for development programme, working in line, obviously, with UK aid and UN Sustainable Development Goals. So one really great aspect of the programme is its competitive nature. Only the best projects get funded. And more importantly, every project is match funded by all the organisations involved on the basis that if everybody contributes, then that has the best chance to deliver a sustainable impact. So technologically, again, as I've mentioned, IPP projects often use satellite observation, satellite tracking and telecommunication services paired with terrestrial, ground source data to create products hand in hand with international partners in new and unconventional ways. These span a variety of themes, including reducing deforestation, improving climate and disaster resilience, saving lives at sea, which I'll come on to in a moment, through improved communication, and improving agricultural practices, and connecting rural hotspots, hospitals and schools to the internet. So really a very wide range of different applications. But technology is not what's at the heart of IPP, rather, as I've mentioned again, it's partnerships, trust and sustainability. So trusted partnerships are forged from the very beginning and grow stronger through the project's lifetime. So end users are involved in the development of solutions to meet their specific needs. Training, capacity building, is a crucial part of positive and practical impacts being realised, even after the grant funding has finished. And sustainability, such that a project is only considered a real success if a solution is used and taken up by the end user in the long term. So I recently had the great pleasure of visiting South Africa to see a couple of our projects on the ground, as it were. One called Oasis has literally saved fishermen's lives through its vessel tracking solution called Exact Trace. Essentially, these are fishermen going out in boats that, if you didn't know better, you might think were for going out for a pleasure ride on the local boating lake. They are taking great risks and often don't have the kind of safety equipment that you would expect fishermen in developed countries to have. They don't tend to have sophisticated radios. They often have their mobile phones. And once they're out of contact of that mobile phone signal, they're extremely vulnerable to either storms or motor breakdowns. So our system there is just providing a very simple satellite communication navigation beacon system to make sure that people know where they are. So when a problem arises, they can be helped. And it's no surprise that over 20 IPP projects have been judged to be more effective at achieving their UN Sustainable Development goal impacts than alternative non-space solutions. So that brings me to CommonSensing. This is a very important project which aims to improve resilience to the devastating impacts of climate change suffered by the vulnerable small island developing states in the Pacific, as Richard's mentioned. This is an excellent partnership, 7 organisations. I'm glad to see many of them represented here today, including the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, Satellite Applications Catapult, and the Commonwealth Secretariat. And it's an essential and very timely endeavour which could be applied post-project to other nations suffering the effects of climate change. So it's a very important pilot that could apply more generally around the world. It's on target, pleased to say, to deliver technological solutions in Fiji next March, and then Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands a few months later. Capacity building is already underway in all 3 island nations. In-country experts are being deployed, and climate advisors will be in place within the next quarter. So the project will close in March 2021. However, as I mentioned earlier, that's certainly not the end. And those 3 words I emphasised, partnership, impact and sustainability, are clearly appreciated by the CommonSensing project. And I really do congratulate them on their progress. So, what next for IPP? Well, I can't say right now, but this programme has a huge amount of support, and I very much hope that we can continue building on the success that we've had so far. We are working on the format for a 3rd call, and we will look to announce that very soon. So please watch this space. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Graham, and I do realise that you have to rush off to another engagement shortly, so really appreciate you joining us here this morning. Now at this point, I'd like to invite another very special guest to give some perspectives from the front lines of climate change in the Pacific region. Please give a warm welcome to His Excellency Jitoku Tikolevu, who is High Commissioner of the Republic of Fiji to the United Kingdom.
Mr. Richard Jones, the editorial director of Devex, Dr. Graham Turnock, CEO, UK Space Agency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Bulwinak, and a very good morning to you all. I'm very happy indeed to be here this morning, although I just got the invitation to be here on Tuesday this week, but I'm really delighted to be here and share with you the experience at the front line of what small states face in terms of the real threat of climate change. I'm sure all of us this morning knows this. There's no secret that many Pacific Island countries in our part of the world, the Caribbeans, and small developing states, cities around the world are disproportionately threatened by climate change and the devastating consequences of extreme weather patterns. You may have all read or even seen at some point the effects that climate change has had on small developing states like Fiji. However, please allow me this opportunity to speak to you from first-hand experience, the vulnerability that it has caused my island nation. According to Fiji's national climate change policy, global sea level changes will more than double by the end of the century. These drastic changes in weather extremes threaten the livelihoods of the Fijian people, affecting our islands' ecosystems on land, at sea. And of course, since 1993, Fiji has recorded 6 millimeter, 0.2 inches increase in our sea level per year. This is larger than the global average. The rapid rise in the sea levels and the resulting saltwater intrusion that stems from the increased ferocity of coastal floods that have made portions of our island nation uninhabitable. The damage sustained, of course, has monetary value, with the damages to Vitilevu, one of our main islands in Fiji, and of course, the most populous island, totaling some 52 million per year, dollars, or 4% of our Fiji's GDP. Rising sea levels together with warmer temperatures increase Fiji's vulnerability to contamination of food resources and waterborne diseases. The small size and isolation of many Pacific Islands communities like Fiji has also led to unhealthy diets through an increasing reliance on imported and processed foods. Changing weather patterns have worsened Fiji's vulnerability to viral diseases outbreaks. For example, Fiji combated a post-food leptospirosis outbreak in 2012 and a dengue fever outbreak in 2013. Ocean acidification continued to have a negative impact on Fiji's coral reef systems, and tropical cyclones have been predicted to increase in intensity. For example, in February 2016, Cyclone Winston ravaged Fiji, claiming the lives of 44 Fijians, destroying homes, uprooting families, and inflicting serious damage on our nation's sugar crop, a foundation of our Fijian economy. Our Prime Minister declared a 30-day state of emergency, with winds recorded at 185 miles per hour and gusts up to 200 miles per hour. Cyclone Winston is recorded as Fiji's worst natural disaster and the strongest storm to ever make landfall in the southern hemisphere, with damages from the storm totaling an estimated $1.4 million, which represents more than a third of Fiji's GDP. Further to this, ladies and gentlemen, climate change continues to represent one of the biggest threats to sustainable development in Fiji, as destructive weather patterns have hindered Fiji's economy and led to the relocation of low-lying communities to higher ground. In 2012, a Fiji community unfortunately had to be relocated to higher ground for their very survival. Residents of Wunindongoloa, a village on the shoreline of Fiji's second largest island, Honolulu, became Fiji's first community to relocate due to climate change. The village's 26 homes sat mere meters from the coast, but with 4 decades of a higher tide and heavier rainfall, Wunindongoloa, its homes, gardens, crops, and trees, found itself at the mercy of relentless, encroaching seawater. Therefore, migrating to higher ground offered the only remaining option for the community. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very delicate process. From government perspective, you can't just go to a particular community and ask them to move immediately. It's a very delicate process. Their grandfathers have been living in those villages for ages. So it's a very delicate process, as government has to go through the protocols to influence the villages to move to highlands. It's the reality because their land has been taken away of rising sea levels. The land has been poisoned by the sea, the salt, so they cannot use those lands. So they have to move. But government has made its commitment to ensure that these villages are relocated to highlands. With these brief depictions this morning, I hope it provides you with an idea of how real and devastatingly vulnerable Fiji and generally SIDS are by the effects of climate change. As this trajectory continues, Fiji has set standards and actions and taken a lead role in advocating of a global united response towards mitigating and adapting to the effects of climate change. These responses can be seen through the following measures. Fiji has aggressively pursued our green growth plan, implementing policies to promote sustainable development and partnering with the private sector and international organizations to elevate the issue on the global stage. Fiji has pledged to transition completely to renewable energy sources by 2030 and has adopted a reforestation policy intended to store carbon from freshly planted trees. Fiji is one of the 3 Pacific countries, as already mentioned, and has partnered with UNITAR and Devex on a 3-year initiative to harness satellite remote sensing making data relating to climate risks and disasters available through a web portal and mobile applications. This would make the output sustainable beyond the end of the project and help us use this data to build resilience and better secure funding for climate change mitigation. In the international arena, Fiji has hosted high-level delegations from United Nations bodies, including the United Nations Secretary General himself, to address the impacts of climate change. Fiji was the first nation to ratify the Paris Agreement, which seeks to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Fiji is one of 43 nations on the Climate Vulnerable Forum and has been a vocal supporter of limiting temperature rise from global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In 2017, Fiji became the first small island developing state to join the Under 2 coalition and the first emerging market to issue a sovereign green bond, thus introducing an environment and climate adaptation levy and launching a rural electrification program to reduce emissions from diesel generators. At this juncture, let me just share with you the vulnerability index. The vulnerability to climate impacts is not isolated to Fiji or even the Pacific Islands countries and the Caribbean and the like. The growing ferocity of storms, the rising seas and changing weather patterns are a global problem, and no economy and no nation will be spared the consequences. International financial institutions have Fiji access to concessional finance on the basis of not on the size of the economy, but on our vulnerability to worsening climate impacts. And this is one issue, one of the challenges, the reality on the ground. One thing is availability of finance from international financial institutions. And for us, it's difficult and very cumbersome to really access those funds because of the process that is required. The boxes has to be ticked. So one good initiative that Fiji has been taking a role together with the Commonwealth is exactly have everyone to a definition of vulnerability index. Financial institutions, unfortunately, they go to their own institutions with respect. How that it operates on the ground is a huge challenge for us. So together with other Pacific Islands and the Commonwealth, we are trying to align the definition of vulnerability index. What actually it means. As I said, and I reiterate the fact that the funds are available, but how do we progress that and how do we apply for that is a huge challenge for us because of the difficulty. Hence the attempt that we are making together with the Commonwealth to actually define clearly that everyone is on the same page in terms of clarifying clearly the definition of vulnerability. Fiji was the first small island state to hold the President of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Under Fiji's presidency, we shared with the world the Pacific concept of Talanoa. We were the COP23 president. It means essentially the process of inclusiveness, participatory and transparent dialogue that takes in the private sector, civil society, academia, media, and others. We have officially launched an important new initiative to develop finance and insurance products for vulnerable and low-income households in Fiji and other Pacific Island countries. Fiji has also shown leadership in addressing the issue of human mobility and climate change with respect to human rights. This is in regard to Fiji's relocation policy, as I already alluded to earlier, whereby there are established guidelines on how to support our communities and people displaced by climate-related impacts. Fiji remains at the front line in advocating international policies to counter climate change and have supported this with the creation and implementation of our own domestic legislations. For example, the Fijian government in August of this year introduced a Climate Change Act that will enshrine in law our domestic response to climate threat and the threat to our oceans, and place the law at the heart of our national policies and priorities. The Act, when made effective, will provide a framework to guide Fiji's implementation of the Paris Agreement, coordinate Fiji's national response to climate change and ocean health, and give us the legal tools to carry out our most important job of safeguarding our people and our communities from the climate threat now and into the future. The Act would, amongst other things, provide a ban on all single-use plastic bags, including those with and without handles, from 1 January 2020, an increase in the plastic bag levy from 20 cents Fijian currency to 50 cents on low-density polyethylene plastic bags from 1 January 2020, a ban on styrofoam from 1 January 2021, and zero duty on non-plastic food packaging such as straws, containers, and cutlery. Fiji continues to do its part in taking rapid and varied actions both on domestic and international levels in responding to the climate crisis. However, collective action from the global community must be encouraged and promoted. Fiji has continuously and ever so continued to call on the global community, please take serious actions to urgently address the warnings of the IPCC special report. Fiji calls on all coal producers to immediately cease any new mining of coal and develop a strategy for the decadal phase out and closure of all existing coal production to reinstate the 1.5 degree benchmark ambition in all the parties to make immediate measures to relinquish the subsidies to fossil fuel production and use and support a transition to appropriate and affordable technologies. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, as the impacts of climate change accelerate and attempts are made to weaken global ambition, we must listen more than ever to the scientists. It's critical, and not the climate deniers or those motivated by self-interest or political interest. Countering the climate crisis requires collective global action, and we must address this global emergency with ambition and urgency. Every country, every institution, every individual has a role to play to ensure the survival of the most vulnerable, and I commend all those who have taken on these global responsibilities with courage and conviction. I thank you for your time and presence this morning. Nagabaleo.
Hi, Commissioner. Thank you very much for those words and for tying so many strands together. I think it demonstrates the scale of the challenge that we as an international community have in front of us. So really appreciate you giving your perspectives from the ground. Now, at this point, I'd like to welcome to the front Lucy Edge, CEO at Satellite Applications Catapult, and Dr. Einar Bjorgo, Director at UNISAT, who will join me at the front to get an insight into how you are building climate resilience through satellite technology in your work around the CommonSensing project. That's great. So welcome both.
Thank you.
Some inspiring and stirring stuff there from the High Commissioner, and I think helps to set the scene, and hopefully we can dig into the CommonSensing project a little bit. Perhaps Einar, starting with you, a few words of introduction. So in a nutshell, what is the CommonSensing project? Perhaps you can give us a sense of the genesis of this project.
Sure. As was mentioned by Graham here earlier, this was in response to a call from the International Partnership Program at the UK Space Agency. Now, what we found as the United Nations, UN Institute for Training and Research, was very interesting in this, because we have this fundamental, let's say, guiding lines that have been developed in terms of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And we are seeing how the IPPs were a perfect match to this. And therefore, we decided to, together with Satellite Applications Catapult, to see if we could establish a consortium that could actually support this. And we are very much geared towards the mantra of the 2030 agenda, one of which is leaving no one behind. So when we were able to see how we could team up, how we could use space technologies in support of countries that are in deep need of assistance when it comes to climate change adaptation, we looked at through our respective networks, and we found both countries that were interested, and we had the matching partners with the right skill sets to meet those needs, because we have to make sure that we are actually meeting the requirements that are communicated to us.
And perhaps a few words on that consortium, the different types of partners that you've coalesced.
Right. So we have partners that are specializing in satellite imagery analysis technologies. We have partners that are specializing in training and capacity development. We have partners that are specializing in climate science and climate prediction, in food security, in media, in outreach. And so bringing all these partners together, we are able to have a good, solid project consortium that can actually support the countries, because that's what it's all about, is supporting the countries, sitting there with the countries over time, building their capacity so that they can make use of the sustainable solutions.
And Lucy, perhaps you want to build on that and share with the audience why the project is so timely, why now, what's the biggest added value that you hope to see in the 3 small island developing states engaged? Talking about timeliness and value add.
Yeah, okay, thank you. When the Sustainable Development Goals came out from the United Nations a number of years ago, we were really excited by them and felt that they gave an opportunity for the space industry to be able to show how it can really add value to some of these big global problems. And so we've always been very interested in engaging on those Sustainable Development Goals. What we've seen more recently, of course, is that the time is right now. It's late, but we have a lot of international interest to really get some proper effort in place now to start really tackling these problems actively. Progress. Yeah, and I think when you look at something like the IPP CommonSensing project, it's been running for over a year already, and it's looking at using really innovative techniques. It's looking at using data which is considered generally to not be very accessible, although of course we believe it is, and it's using a consortium from across the globe to really come together and to address a very tricky problem. And in order to do that, you've got to be willing to look at the risk associated with it and have an appetite for that risk. And I think now, because of the movement and the messaging that we're hearing, people are more willing, governments are more willing, and organisations are certainly very much more interested in getting behind those innovative activities to really try, like you say, accelerate some of these solutions.
So you feel that the urgency of the situation in front of us is perhaps making the international community a bit more conducive to not being so risk averse, if you like?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, with IPP CommonSensing particularly, of course, it's been an idea that the team has been working on for a number of years already. And really what we want to see is that CommonSensing demonstrates to everybody else how this can be done. We don't have to wait until the end of the project. Graham mentioned, we've got over a year to go still. It doesn't have to wait till then. Things are happening already. Work is in progress. We work through an agile format, so people are developing things all the time. The teams are working together. We're working with Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. So we've got 3 different user-focused solutions. And that can be adapted and developed already in different places. We don't have to wait.
And sort of moving from the geographies to the thematics, Einar, I wondered from your perspective if you could give us a snapshot, if you would, on the goals around issues such as climate finance and climate action policy and reducing the impact of natural disasters, making food systems more secure. How are you hoping that CommonSensing and its derived technology and the consortium as a whole is really helping to kind of push the needle on progress here?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we are very ambitious in this project,
Yep.
and I think we should be, we have to be. Without that, we are risking not having the big impact that we are seeking. So what is important here is to really work with the experts, and also to realize that, as the Sustainable Development Agenda very clearly lays out, is that all these goals are interconnected.
Yes.
So there's no one track on health, there's no one track on climate change. They're all interconnected. And this project integrates that thought set into the way we have designed the project. So climate change is real, as we just heard, the High Commissioner said very, very clearly. So we are providing, the main goal is to make the countries more adaptable and being able to adapt to the changing in climate. How can we do that the best possible way? Well, it is one of the main avenues is to have better access to climate funds, so that they themselves, the countries themselves, have the expertise, the knowledge, the skills in order to say, this is what we need, and it is caused by climate change. Because if you can't prove that it's caused by climate change, you can't access necessarily these climate funds. So having those skill sets is absolutely fundamental. So that is what the capacity in the end that we do want to build. So having climate finance advisors in place, having experts sitting with the government over time, not just for a week, but over time, at the duration of the project, it's very, very important. So when we are able to do that, we do hope that we can integrate the various tools and let's say services, if you like, solutions that CommonSensing is coming up with to make this sustainable and make the countries more successful in accessing climate change on their own premises and with their own, let's say, buy-in and interest. And also better implement. You can also use the same tool to implement the project that you are proposing.
And ultimately, to safeguard the future of the project's sustainability, this needs to be a community-based approach.
Absolutely. It's critical that also, of course, from the government side, that this is integrated. You mentioned policy, that this is integrated into policies. And early on in the project, we had the pleasure of sitting in the Fijian parliament ourselves and seeing the discussions and how extremely on the ball they are when it comes to these issues.
And Lucy, perhaps you could give us a sense of the tech in terms of how you're battling or mitigating the effects of climate change. What sort of support systems, visualizations, analytics are emerging from some of this data that is being gathered, and how are you then harnessing it for good on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, the High Commissioner's speech was really sobering, wasn't it? And it's not often, I think, people would connect in their brains messages like His Excellency has just given to us with launching a satellite on a rocket. You know, that doesn't happen often in people's heads. But the reality is, by using satellite technology, you get a global view, you get a set of measurement information that is very timely, very repeatable, and can look really at very big picture patterns, which you can't get in other ways. That doesn't mean that it stands alone or that it's better than other data, but it does come from a different angle, of course, and has some unique benefits as a result of it. The challenges are that the space industry has historically been quite separate from other sectors, and accessing the information as another sector wanting that data, or from the space sector approaching, say, the agri-tech sector, or the climate scientists working on the ground in regions, the language that the space sector speaks hasn't always helped.
And so how do we overcome that challenge in practice?
So really, it boils down to a phrase that everybody will know very well, and it's about user-centered design. You know, it's about being in the region, working with people, working with the kind of experts that will always be in the region, because you talked about sustainability.
Yeah.
So there's no point in focusing on a particular area that's interesting to me and my company, but of no interest to people that we're trying to work with. That user-centered design is absolutely critical to everything you do, because that identifies, A, what the problem is that people want to solve. It identifies the environment that they are working in, so you know, the tools that they are going to have available to them, and also where they are going to move their own understanding over time and where they want to move it, so you can create a solution that makes sense to people who want to use it.
And perhaps finally, the next frontiers for the CommonSensing project. We've touched upon how you're going to hopefully achieve scale and sustainability here, but perhaps you have a piece of advice for the audience in the room or others looking to replicate this kind of project in another region. What would be your one key piece of advice that you'd share based on the experience of CommonSensing so far, Einar?
Well, I would say it's extremely important to take stock of what exists. There are other projects, other initiatives in this region, and we should not compete. We should play on each other. We should feed into existing project. We should benefit from existing project. That is one thing. And the other thing is just making use of this technology. The satellite images are a fantastic solution, data source. These are global goals. These are global data, and it's a perfect match. You can look back in time. We're talking about climate change. Well, how do you determine change? Well, you go back in time and see what was the situation before. The satellite images provide all this. So being able to combine that with also being present in the countries, as also Lucy said, sitting there with the government, and we are listening to their needs in terms of user-centered design, that is the way forward. And if we want to scale up, we have to make sure that we prove that and that we're able to follow through on that as well.
And Lucy, the final word, as Catapult is a convener of people and projects, what would your advice be to our audience about setting up a project like CommonSensing? What's been your sort of most striking takeaway?
For me, I think the big message is we're innovating on a very, very difficult problem. We don't always know exactly what the perfect solution is, but we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. And releasing funding, releasing opportunities, convening consortia around an idea that may appear to have some risk around it, but could potentially have, as Einar says, massive beneficial impact. Let's be confident. Let's take those steps. Let's give it a go.
Lucy, Einar, thank you very much. To be continued after this session. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much. At this point, we'd like to show you a very short video teaser to give you an insight into our content series, Turning the Tide, and some of the issues that we're aiming to explore in our next session. So if we can run VT, please. I'd encourage everyone to check out turningthetide.devex.com, and certainly some food for thought as we move on to our next panel, which is called Realities and Solutions to Building Climate Change Resilience. Now, to lead us through this conversation, I'd like to invite my colleague Helen Morgan, Associate Editor and Producer at Devex, to take to the floor, and I'll introduce our panelists. An esteemed range of panelists today that we have for you: Dr. Megan Bailey, who's Technical Advisor at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre; Kate Brown, who is Executive Director of the Global Island Partnership; Anthony Cox, who's Deputy Director at the OECD's Environment Directorate; Dr. Nick Hardman-Mountford, Head of Oceans and Natural Resources at the Commonwealth Secretariat; and last but not least, Dr. Einar Bjorgo, Director at UNISAT. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for your panelists.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks to our expert panelists for being here, and everyone in the audience, and for those tuning in on the live stream as well. Before we start, I just wanted to frame this part of the morning and this conversation that we'll be having, because as we've already heard, the conversation on climate change is a truly global one, and there is a growing sense of urgency. And there are calls for a shift away from discussions and towards action, so that's what we'll be focusing on now. As Richard mentioned, the realities and solutions to building climate change resilience and how to implement them. I also wanted to mention that this is a conversation, so please do feel free to jump in and share your perspectives and experience on different topics, and particularly as you're all from such a broad range of different sectors and expertise. And I also wanted to let the audience know that we will have a little bit of time at the end for some questions, so please do get thinking about those. So, Kate, I wanted to begin with you to put this discussion into context. I know we've already heard from the High Commissioner there, but given your over 10 years of experience working in small island developing states, what are your reflections on the realities of the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events?
Thank you very much. And I've actually lived in Fiji. It's a great country, and also Samoa. I think one of the things that we tend to see, we hear a lot of what are the problems of small island developing states, but our partnership was actually founded to look more at what are the solutions, what can we do something about, and we have really focused on a few things. I think our partnership is a partnership that's working not just with small island developing states, but with all islands, regardless of their political status. And so many of the issues that we see in small island developing states, we also see in other islands, whether it's Hawaii, whether it's the big islands of Japan and Indonesia. And Japan obviously is about to face a major typhoon, I think, as we're talking. So some of the solutions that we see coming out of the small island developing states are relevant to lots of other places. And I think part of this discussion is really about how do we scale things up? How do we move away from kind of identifying always problems, and always with SIDS, we very much focus on lack of capacity to do things. I think I've been working in small island developing states issues for about 20 years, and I think the capacity issue is real. I mean, some of these countries have 20,000 people managing international stuff, a huge ocean area, trying to implement things, and dealing with these the risks associated with things like climate change and sea level rise, and also some other things that are happening regardless of whether we have climate change impacts, including overfishing, over-harvesting of resources. So we see these all put pressure on how these islands actually are going to respond. If we were only dealing with climate change, maybe we could do something, but we're dealing with massively diverse issues and problems, and then we're dealing with lots of other things that are impacting these. And as someone, I lived in Samoa for 10 years and went through a cyclone there on another island, and I had to shelter in a church because I was at a family reunion. It's a long story. But the point is, it took 6 weeks for us to get lots of services running again. And I live now in Washington, D.C., and people say, well, why didn't the people in Bahamas just go somewhere else? Well, there isn't actually somewhere else to go to. So you're actually, I think, besides the actual problems, there's also the psychological toll that living with the sense of this impending doom that you both are seeing in reality, but also are hearing constantly in all of the political discourse. Places like Tuvalu have people there constantly studying and taking photos of climate change impacts. But people in Tuvalu, they want to stay living in Tuvalu. They want to have productive lives in Tuvalu. So our challenge, I think, as a development community is how we help people both with the idea of risk and the idea of some of these issues that they are going to be facing. For example, Solomon Islands is going to have a major food security problem even without climate change because of fishing and the coastal fisheries potentially really being reduced. So these are issues we've got to deal with them in an integrated way. And I think, as I was saying, in our partnership, which was formed about 14 years ago by 2 island leaders, the idea was that the solutions are really about firstly focusing on action rather than talking, which we don't really work on policy at the international level. We try to illustrate what islands are actually doing and help them provide a voice about the positive solutions. I think the second thing is about political leadership. So as we could see from the Fiji High Commissioner, a lot of these islands are really taking real political leadership. Lots of the islands that we work with are trying all sorts of innovative things to deal with their capacity issues around climate finance, around implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and we need to support that. I think the other thing is really helping islands to collaborate with each other. As I was saying before, we were formed to help islands work together regardless of political status. So some of the solutions are in small island developing states, and I think this technology is really interesting. I just came from 2 weeks ago, and I see some people on this panel were also there, from the UN General Assembly, and I think earlier speakers really touched on the opportunity that the Sustainable Development Goals offer to look at things in a much more integrated way. The problem is, even during the UN General Assembly, I saw a real focus on singular goals, and that is not going to help us as we move forward. And I actually also was at an event that went for a whole day where the conclusion was that other SDGs get more attention than the one that someone was talking about, and that climate change had gotten too much attention versus poverty reduction. And I was like, what on earth? So our challenge, I think, is to not think in silos and not implement things in silos. And so the opposite thing is that islands actually offer an opportunity to do that because of their scale and their size, and that they want to actually do something. I live in the United States, in Washington, D.C., where we have these types of conversations a lot. There's a lot of action going on in the sub-national level in the US, but I really think while the small islands are going to be facing these problems fast, some of the solutions are going to be helpful to places like the UK, to places like the US. And so we need to facilitate that back and forth and not look at things in this kind of developed country and developing country context. So I don't think it's really helpful. And I also think that for small island developing states, we need to see them for their strengths and not always the things that they can't do. And we really need to be advocating that. There was a lot of really great things actually launched at the UN General Assembly. But I think one of the things to reflect on, we talked about it as the Climate Summit. So the Climate Summit was at the start of the week. Midway through the week was the high-level stuff on the SDGs. But the end of the week, which we always forget about, was the high-level meeting for the Samoa Pathway, the Sustainable Development Priorities of Small Island Developing States. And just actually by being at the end of the week, it kind of is deprioritized as an issue. So I encourage us to also think about how do we bring that really important voice back into the room. And then finally, I think with the SDG implementation opportunity, we know that that has to be implemented at the local level. It can't be us talking about it in New York. We have to figure out how do we get this down to local community level, very relevant in the Pacific, where most things take place at a much more local level than we see in large developed countries. And so we launched actually an initiative during the UN General Assembly, really looking at, it's called Local 2030 Islands Network, looking at how do we find the islands that are really wanting to lead on SDG implementation and help them work together, particularly around this process on identifying their goals, looking at their accountability mechanisms. So I think things like this project is really interesting for that. And then how do we support a project pipeline? How do we help identify innovative solutions and scale them? And so that's kind of what we were looking at as one of the solutions to some of these issues in terms of better integration, really trying to understand what you're doing and helping kind of locally people understand that as well.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to draw on your point about not working in silos and ask you, Megan, so from the humanitarian perspective, but also working in climate science at the Climate Centre, you focus on the integration of climate science in and humanitarian practice. So what do you think is the biggest challenge in bringing together those two fields, and how do you work to overcome those challenges?
That's a great question. One lesson we learned in trying to integrate science and specifically satellite technologies is that it isn't enough just to have that sort of early warning, that indication that sort of risk levels of a particular disaster event are increasing, but there has to be a whole system around it that allows there to be action that happens in response to that early warning that is provided by a wide range of forecasting technologies, such that you're actually able to spend significant humanitarian funds to take action to reduce those impacts. And we found over and over again, trying to integrate, early warning with early action, there was a sort of bottleneck there, and that it's that the systems. One, sometimes those products are not fit for purpose. They don't tell us about the extremity of the event that we think is worthy to take action of. Perhaps they haven't done the right analysis to figure out how often they would be wrong, how often they would be right. These kinds of information that are really important for us as the end user to know, can we use this information to make decisions? Is it sufficiently reliable that we can invest large amounts of humanitarian funding to initiate a pre-disaster set of humanitarian actions? So Lucy mentioned this sort of user face. I can't remember the exact term. User-centered design. This is something that we've been hearing about a lot, but still there are big challenges to try and create these products. But then also having the guts to kind of spend money on those products when you do have an indication, from Earth observation or from usually a composite index of lots of different kinds of science that are giving an indication of an increased risk of a disaster. When there is that information provided, to actually have the flexible funding and the confidence from those that are providing that funding to spend money based on an uncertain, based on information that inherently has some level of uncertainty in terms of what impacts you would receive. So I think these are the sort of the two major challenges, I would say, is sort of the design of those products that are meant to help us make decisions, and the sort of confidence to make decisions based on those products, rather than only working in a response capacity after disaster has already hit, based, with the idea that it is possible that we will act in vain. It is possible that funds could have been better spent elsewhere in hindsight, and having this confidence to accept that risk, and to try and make plans to deal with that risk, and who accepts the risk, whether try and keep it more at the institutional level rather than at the community level, in terms of making actions that are low risk, that people are not going to regret taking based on early warning information that we get from science. So those I think are the key points that we within the Red Cross are trying to address, and I think we have made some progress, particularly on the financing side, being able to spend money based on an early warning indicator, and sort of have the confidence to deal with it if it ends up being a false alarm. Thankfully, a false alarm if there is no disaster event that happens.
So what's your take on the kind of state of play of current climate resilience efforts in practice?
I think we're just making huge progress. There's so much focus at the moment, which is very welcomed. Certainly, I mean, we are already seeing a very changing disaster profile. There are, Red Cross national societies that are dealing with different kinds of disasters, more extreme droughts, more extreme floods, cyclones, that are kind of pushing them above what their institutional capacity it is. Of course, we expect these changes to increase, so these continued stressors on local level first responders that are dealing with disaster events associated with the changing climate. So the attention is needed. I think we're seeing progress all the time with different science partnerships, and I think we've got the right idea of trying to bring these pieces together, trying to be, as Einar mentioned, sharing in our information and not trying to keep things in terms of intellectual property. Publish my journal article, then I'm willing to put it out. I think I think we are seeing a lot of sharing, and certainly we see that within the Red Cross movement. Lots of institutions that are really happy to be working with us, and we to reduce humanitarian impacts, and it's very, very welcome, and we really appreciate it.
And Einar, I actually wanted to bring that sort of similar theme to you in terms of the potential for technology and innovation at the intersection of climate resilience efforts and specifically disaster risk reduction, which I know we've talked about already a little.
Yeah, I think clearly this technology that we are using has a huge potential for disaster risk reduction. It is being used, it has been used in the past, but you can do quite easy. It's very straightforward, and the technology is becoming more and more accessible. While before you needed a big team of specialists, today that threshold is much, much lower to make use of this information. So as an example, one can mention, for example, exposing areas or identifying areas exposed to landslides. That is a fairly straightforward thing to do. You can have information about the terrain, about the slope, about the type of land cover you have, and based on those parameters, you can have good information about how vulnerable a community is in terms of landslides. Are they just downstream or just below a mountain or a ridge where we know from the imagery and the geodata that there's a high risk, high vulnerability towards landslide, for example. Another example would be that we have, as I mentioned, we have a record of what has happened in the past. So we have facts. We know which areas were flooded in the past and exactly where it was, when it was. So all this information then needs to be gathered. And as you said, there's always some, the accuracy level depends. But nevertheless, it is much, much better information available now than it was 20 years ago. So we should use this information. We should build the capacities with the countries so that, and also the local communities and their expertise, because they have a lot of expertise locally. And we should combine this information, and then it's up to them to take the decisions. I've seen some of the satellite images of villages that have been moved, for example, as the High Commissioner mentioned. And it's also, of course, a very emotional aspect to this that we, from the techie side, have to be very, very, very respectful of. So it is about integrating this into normal decision making. And I think here today we have a great opportunity to do so compared to what we had in the past, because it's so much more accessible, and we understand also now better how to do that. So the techno push, of course, is totally out. One have to avoid that, but nevertheless, making the technology available through understanding of the needs, this is what it's all about. And that is what we have been doing as UNOSAT for the last 18 years now. Actually, I just want to highlight today is our birthday. We're 18 years old today, so young adults, or I don't know what. But yeah, so we have some experience in that, and both in terms of the satellite image analysis, but also the capacity development, because we're able to transfer those skills to the countries that needs them, and that for us that is where we see our role basically.
And congratulations on the
Thank you
birthday. Nick, I wanted to turn over to you now and talk about oceans. So given your experience in the areas of oceans and natural resources, could you tell us a bit about capacity building, as Einar just mentioned, to address ocean challenges specifically, and what the Secretariat is doing on this issue?
Yeah, sure. We talk a lot about small island developing states, and I really don't like the term because they have a small land area. But this small island sounds like a small mentality, and the things we're seeing from these small island developing states is a global view, a global voice, really speaking up on climate change. They are also very large states if you take account of their ocean area. Large ocean states, or big ocean states, is a much better name. If you take, for example, Seychelles has 3,000 times the amount of sea area as it does land area. Or if you look at Kiribati, 3 island groups in the center of the Pacific with a combined land area of 811 kilometers squared. It's tiny. But if you look at its ocean area, it's the size of the continental US and spans all 4 hemispheres. So, and that's really consistent with this global Pacific mentality. They've always seen themselves as a blue continent, the stewards of the ocean. This is what island states can bring to us, is this perspective of ocean stewardship and working together. And the ocean is not what divides us, it's what joins us together. So the ocean is massively important to this discussion. Commonwealth countries have 24 of the world's small island developing states, so the majority of the world's small island developing states in the Commonwealth, and the majority of the world's small states as well. And so last year, at our Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, all the Commonwealth countries agreed unanimously that they wanted to make a commitment on the ocean, and that was captured in our Commonwealth Blue Charter. And this is a commitment not to do another high-sounding thing, but to say we've made all these high-level commitments internationally and we can't implement them. So if we work together, can we really make progress on this? And we're talking about user-centered design. It doesn't just apply to technology, it applies to policy instruments and frameworks as well. So this started with the countries saying what they needed. And the prioritization was done by countries stepping forward and saying, we want to champion this topic because this is our highest priority. And other countries getting around them on that and forming action groups, covering topics such as coral reef restoration, mangrove ecosystems and livelihoods, marine protected areas, blue economies, sustainable aquaculture, but also big topics like ocean and climate change, which is Fiji is leading on. And marine plastic pollution, which Vanuatu is leading on with the UK. These are massively important. Ocean acidification was mentioned by the Fiji High Commissioner, and New Zealand's leading on that. You know, we've got these topics that are right at the heart of what it means to live there. There's an article out on Bloomberg today about, you know, what's it mean to the world if we lose a coral reef? And actually, you know, that is a massively important question. It's not just a loss of a diving holiday. A coral reef is a source of income, livelihood, food, coastal protection, spirituality, and community existence for island communities. So there's a lot to be lost. And by restoring coastal ecosystems, we can protect against the effects of climate change. But of course, we can't manage anything if we don't measure it. So the importance of projects like CommonSensing and the use of satellite technologies and all this great stuff of having data in the clouds you can draw down, and you know, in Fiji they can have a great GIS system, or in Vanuatu and Solomon Islands they can get it through the web and access this stuff and put it in a data cube and look at the change through time and space and make decisions based on that is massively important. But only if it can be supported for the long term as well. So climate finance is a massive issue in this. We hear about big numbers for climate finance, but it's nowhere near big enough, because climate change is at a point where we used to thinking, what are the options for climate change? Can we do this or that about it? It's very clear from the reports coming out last year is that we have to do everything now. There are no options left. We just have to do everything. And so replenishing the Green Climate Fund, making sure all the finance is there, making sure that that is accessible to countries at the scale they need. And that's where another area the Commonwealth has really been putting a lot of effort, is that we have something called the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, to really assist countries in getting access to climate finance and building capacity in that. So we had an initial investment of $1 million Australian dollars, which is about £500,000, and that got replenished in 2018, plus another $500,000 from the UK. So Australia and UK funded that. So if we put it into US, it's about $1.8 million US dollars went into that. They've to date, in 3 years, got 27.5 million of projects up in Commonwealth countries. 10 climate finance advisors, another 5 just going to come online soon, working particularly with small states and least developed countries who are the most climate vulnerable to get this finance in place for projects on the ground. Even better, they've got $500 million of projects in the pipeline now. And this all becomes because the global architecture for climate finance is complicated. Different providers, different rules, different policies, different regulations, different accessibility requirements. And bringing it together in a way that's understandable is really hard. So you know, ahead of getting that architecture refined and everybody working together, we're just working with countries to understand it, to work directly with the providers, make sure there's a good relationship and that projects actually get up. So that's a real success story there. That needs to expand. There's very few ocean projects getting funded at the moment, and yet for most of these countries, the ocean is where the biggest threats of climate change are coming from. Cyclones and hurricanes, sea level rise, salination of soils resulting in groundwater. You know, and that then has a knock-on on agriculture and the things on land. But the bleaching of coral reefs, destruction of food protein and coastal resources. And then also, you know, we're talking countries that are not contributing to the CO2 problem. So if they're going to manage this problem, it's about building resilience and adaptation. So, you know, yes, addressing overfishing and illegal and unregulated fishing is massively important, because if you've got healthy coastal ecosystems, they're going to be more resilient to the effects of climate change. And if you're putting all these other pressures on them, they're not. So tools to address that, such as Global Fishing Watch's platform, which brings out, you know, sort of combines satellite AIS data, which is ship tracking data, with other satellite data, and maps fishing fleet behaviour and fishing vessel behaviour, where it's going into marine protected areas, where there's transshipments happening at sea and all that, and making it suddenly visible for policy making. These sort of technologies are massively important.
I wanted to draw on the climate finance conversation and bring this to you, Anthony, and we will be opening to the floor for questions shortly, to let you know. So in terms of climate finance, we've heard there from Nick a few of the challenges, but from your perspective at OECD, what would you say the challenges are in supporting access to climate finance?
Oh, thanks, Helen. I mean, it's a huge issue, and the OECD really doesn't view climate just as a climate issue. It really is an integrated economic development innovation issue, and so we very much bring a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approach to it. And although we've got some 36 member countries, we work with nearly 100 non-OECD countries in various forms, in various ways. And in this space, in the climate finance space, it's critical, because the best laid plans under the SDGs, under the Paris Agreement, under national development, nationally determined contributions and so on, if you don't finance them, it's not going to happen. And so we are putting a huge amount of effort into trying to ensure that the OECD's value added in terms of developing policy guidance, in terms of identifying and pooling and diffusing best practices, in terms of standard setting, and acting as a platform to bring countries and stakeholders together, is really focused around trying to drive investment into climate resilient infrastructure. And this is, and it's not just a developing country issue, it's an OECD issue too. A lot of the infrastructure in OECD countries is old and needs to be replaced. And if we don't replace it with climate smart infrastructure, we are just locking in a whole nother centuries worth of carbon emissions. So while it's the issues in OECD and non-OECD countries are quite different, the challenges are still very much the same. There's a lot of cross-learning that we've done. In the space of climate finance, Nick's exactly right. It's a fragmented landscape. There's a huge coordination issue to be done there. There's a lot of work to be done to identify good policies, to improve capacity, to develop an enabling environment. Scalability has been mentioned. Mobilising commercial finance is critical. And so things like we're doing at the OECD, like events such as our Green Investment Finance Forum, which is on in a few weeks' time, which brings together institutional investors, policymakers, regulators, NGOs, countries, to get that conversation going, to help get onto a common page, a common language, common understanding about the challenges and the opportunity. So those kind of platform events, down to country engagement. We are actively working in a number of developing countries on issues such as clean energy finance, ocean finance, and the aim there is to have a multi-stakeholder engagement over time. You're quite right. You can't fly in, fly out. You have to be there for a while to improve the capacity there, but to try and see what is required in terms of the overarching, the integrated domestic policy solution that's required. Because climate finance isn't just about how much money is coming out of banks. It's about what your finance regulations look like, what your product market regulations look like, how you're planning your cities, how your city finance is arranged. We've seen the growth of things like green bonds. And that's huge, and that's very welcome, but there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of confusion about how to access those, how to drive those, a lot of lack of investor familiarity with these kind of innovative techniques and tools. So our role is to try and bridge that, to improve the understanding, improve the capacity, just so we can drive not just the billions, but the trillions. I mean, we are very much focused around the 100 billion commitment under the Paris Agreement, and that's important, hugely important, and we're tracking that, and progress is being made, but clearly a lot more needs to be done on both the public and the private side, making the conditions so that private sector is able to invest with confidence in climate resilient infrastructure, and making sure that governments are able to access these forms of finance. So we're very much in there, and I think there's a huge role that can be played to try and learn across OECD and non-OECD countries.
Yeah, absolutely vital. So we just want to open up to the audience. I have so many more questions, but we clearly don't have time for all of them. There are some mics going around, so if you'd like to put up your hand and just state your name and just try and keep the questions short and to the point if possible.
Thank you. James Kemmel. I work for a company called Inmarsat. I'm also a member here. A question, I think, to the OECD and to the Commonwealth Office as well. You both talked about the importance of integrated approaches to all of this, and given that this is very much a space theme in the background, do you engage with the space activities as part of all of that? The OECD has a very well-respected space grouping, and of course the Space Agency, National Space Council in the UK, is gaining some prominence. Are they a moving part in your world? Do you have aspirations to do more? Could you say a little about that?
Can I go first?
Yes.
Absolutely, it's a great question. You're quite right. We have a space program in our Futures program that has done some very good work in this space. But in my area, in the Environment Directorate, we are making increasing use of satellite data for developing indicators to monitor progress. In the past, we've relied on sending out pages and pages of questionnaires to countries. You know, tell us what your water quality indicators are, and they send it back. A very tiresome, laborious process. We can do that now with integrated satellite data, and with the increased power of computing, we can do all this in real time. We can get indicators much faster to policymakers, so we can monitor progress. One of the strengths of the OECD is cross-country comparisons. Countries love to see where they sit on the league table. Up the top is better, of course. So we now get more consistent data that is not dependent on laborious ground sampling and so on. So we're making huge use of that, and I think there's huge potential for it as we head into AI and the whole enforcement question, crowdsourcing as well, and open source data. No, this is huge, and I think it's for the monitoring, compliance, and enforcement. It's a huge part of our work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Integration is important, and a holistic view. Island people are inherently systems thinkers, and that's a great advantage to tackling things in an island setting. So it's about integrating satellite technology with in situ measurements as well, and actually capacity building around that as well, I think is a key role. So we have an ocean observation action group through the Commonwealth Blue Charter that Canada championed. And we're working on that, and with partners like Vulcan, who have their Coral Reef Atlas, Paul Allen Coral Reef Atlas, which will give sort of live tracking of the health of coral reefs. But they need partners on the ground to be able to make those measurements. Countries need to develop the skill sets and the scientific capacity around being able to make those measurements. So if we can work together on that and really have a joined-up approach, then it's going to not just be a service provided to island states, but an integrated project together, which builds educational capacity, and again has this holistic view to addressing SDGs and the development needs as a whole. So that's one example, and there's a lot of others. I mean, the CommonSensing project, which we're talking about today, the Commonwealth is a key partner in with UK Space Agency and UNITAR and others in there, and you know, but we do all have to work together.
So just in the last few minutes, this is a bit of a challenge because I'm going to ask you to keep these short. But I'd like to end on a call to action. So what do you each think is next for climate resilience, and what is your call to action to really make it happen? And Megan, I'll start with you. Sorry.
Okay, our call to action. Gosh, there are so many. I mean, one, I think, is to take advantage of this moment because there is so much attention, and we've been wanting to have this attention placed on climate change for such a long time, and it feels like we're finally there in terms of you have people's, you know, it feels like we've got the attention of the world to focus on this and to make key decisions and to make real commitments, and I guess the important thing will be to translate that commitment into meaningful action, into action in and of itself, but also action that is actually helpful to the most vulnerable people. That we think is, you know, interventions that are rigorous, interventions that, you know, that we can see demonstrably that we are reducing vulnerability to extreme events, but to broadly the stressors imposed by a changing climate. So I think just trying to really take advantage of this time and make sure that the commitments that are being made are specific and can be delivered, and ultimately don't lose focus on who are the most affected and who is it that we need to push, you know, all of this momentum towards in terms of reducing the impacts that they experience of a changing climate.
Absolutely. And Kate, what's next for climate resilience from your perspective?
Yeah, I think if we look back at the Samoa pathway, just looking at the small island developing states or the big ocean states or whatever we're going to call them, the focus for the Samoa government when they did that wasn't on an outcome statement, it was on partnerships. It was on the idea of partnerships to support sustainable development in small island developing states, including building climate resilience. And I think we're 5 years since then. We need to do more. I think a lot of the partnerships that they wanted to see happen are not necessarily where they are. So I think there's a real opportunity to, like, we see things like this, to really start thinking bigger than projects at the system. And we need to do that as together in partnership, and I think that's really the call to action, because I think projects are great and will get us somewhere, but unless they fit into something, we're going to just keep doing them forever. So we need to kind of raise up our ideas a little.
And Anthony?
Not surprising, I think finance is going to be key, but I think we're on the cusp of a revolution here. That we're seeing the social revolution with Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes and so on, but in the finance sector, there is so much innovation happening, and the private sector is out in front of government. They are driving this, and I think if we can harness that, if we can encourage governments to catch up, work with the private sector to bring in innovative financial tools, make use of the IT revolution that's happening there, the information revolution, we can do a lot. And I think there's the kinds of things such as blockchain technology and so on and so forth, and it's just increasing our ability to drive investment in the right way.
Two things. Firstly, the ocean. The ocean has been our friend for so long. It's taken up 90% of the excess heat from climate change, a third of the carbon emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution. It is suffering as a consequence, and we are suffering because of that. So bringing ocean into the climate change negotiations, into climate change work plans, particularly through the Blue COP this year in Chile, is hugely important. The second is we've got to keep working together multilaterally, strengthen the multilateral environment, make sure we are all on the same page and not going it alone.
I would say keep it simple, pick the low-hanging fruits, and in terms of what we are doing, there's a lot of now free and open source satellite imagery information out there that is just waiting to be used. It has been a huge issue, I would say, in the past. That's 95% of the collected Earth observation data are never put to use. Now, with AI, with other methods, we can actually start to make use of this past information. But pick the low-hanging fruits here. They're so easily available today. They were not a couple of years ago. And then integrate it into the national decision-making processes. Because if you don't do that, you can't put it to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. They're all completely different, so that's really great. We have a lot of actions to take home. So I'm afraid that we are out of time, but thank you all so much for coming and for such a fruitful and action-oriented discussion. And so I'd welcome everyone to take their seats again as we welcome Farhana Yamin, founder and CEO of Track Zero, to the lectern for the closing keynote address.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to come here. And as some of you may know, I've been advising the small island states, the big ocean states, actually since 1991, mainly participating as their legal advisor and also doing a lot of strategy work and over time work on trying to get them funding as well. Since that time, I've got here, my 3 conventions that I've quite battered. Obviously the Paris Agreement looks a bit shinier and newer than the Climate Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. And basically, I want to share some very candid thoughts with you. I'm also wearing a Ambition 1.5 badge. I don't know if you can see it, and also an Extinction Rebellion symbol, because since last year I decided that it was far more useful for me as a lawyer to break the law and join a campaign for non-violent civil disobedience than to carry on. I am carrying on, by the way, but then to simply say that we were going to fix it through the climate negotiations and even through the climate legislation, which has happened all over the world. So I'm intensely proud of the achievements that we've all collectively worked for. I'm looking at Anthony, who's the OECD and played a crucial role as well in getting the goal of net zero by 2050, actually, into the Paris Agreement. It doesn't quite say that, but that's what Paris did. It made everyone realise that emissions globally had to be at this point, and it's become a rallying cry then. But that was, 4 years ago. So the story is no longer net zero by 2050. That already is too late because of the massive gap in emissions that there was when we already got to Paris. And in Paris, along with the small islands, I acted for the Marshall Islands and have done since 2013. I stopped when I became a rebel so that I didn't in any way feel constrained or compromise their position. But let me tell you, in all honesty, the grief, rage, hurt, terror, and sadness is there. And I felt it was better for me to speak about that in my own name and with the benefit of these 30 years of experience than to be someone who wrote speeches about it, frankly, and talking points and devised strategies in these negotiations. So I know that sounds not as uplifting as you may want it to be, but I think we need to be really, really honest about where we are. So we're for 30 years, more or less every 5 years in these conventions, this one, we've had more or less a 5-year push to increase ambition, to revise the commitments that countries were able to put forward, nation states were able to put forward. Since 1992, the 92 Convention itself said, mandated COP1, which I attended as a young mother with a 6-month-old baby who's now 25 and married. That COP, the first COP, had its review of the adequacy of commitments. And it was inadequate, and we got Kyoto. That mandated a review of its inadequate commitments under the first commitment period. We did that. It was still inadequate. And in Paris, we tried a little new trick. We called the review of the adequacy of commitments the ambition cycle, like a positive way of framing that somehow we were going to not just carry on reviewing the inadequacy of commitments, but we were going to ambitiously push for a positive vision. And sadly, the Paris pathway doesn't look like it's going to get to the level of ambition that's required, because the degree of credibility between where global emissions now are and the countries and where they are geopolitically looks pretty bleak. It looks pretty bleak. And I was in the UN last week, two weeks ago, whenever it was, 2 weeks ago, and essentially sort of 70 countries turned up saying they intended to revise or had already improved their commitments, including the Marshall Islands. And nearly all of those countries were small island states or LDC states. Essentially none of the big emitting countries, none of the G20 countries clearly committed to enhancing their commitments in any way commensurate with the well below 2 degrees, let alone the 1.5. So where does that leave us? I think, and where does that leave you as the development community? I think we have to acknowledge where we actually are. And I think that acknowledgement is what is driving the massive outpouring of anger, rage, accountability, grief, and public protest. That is what is bringing out our young people all over the world in the biggest global movement ever, actually. Over 7 million people joined the strikes over that week from the 20th to the 27th. Over 1,000 people have been arrested just in the last 4 days, and the rebels show no sign of being deterred, and they will continue with their aim of continuing this protest for 2 weeks. These protests are now happening all over the world. Obviously not in the same way in many of the countries which now have repressive regimes, the democratic space for making these protests is shrinking in every country, and every indicator that you can care to examine is showing that actually environmental defenders, truth tellers of environmental injustice, journalists, for example, are being murdered and killed and silenced or put under surveillance. And that's happening in Europe, East Europe, Latin America, India, China, you name it, the US, they're being stigmatized, put under surveillance, and in the worst case, killed and murdered. And actually environmental journalists are at the highest risk of threat. So it's a pretty gloomy picture. And what I feel I can speak to you about is my own realization that I can't just any longer be a kind of lawyer that turns up at these meetings. I have to also speak as a mother of 4 children born in the intervening years at one of these major COP cycles. And I have to speak as a human being. And I can't keep compartmentalizing, the separation of my life anymore. And I'm asking you to be that person who now unites what you know and speaks to it with more honesty. The panel here, the ambassador from Fiji, Kate herself, all of you have spoken actually of the gravest injustices which are happening in our lifetime, right now, right before our eyes. And sometimes I think we don't want to face them or neutralize the language, and we want to talk and still speak, of essentially now incremental solutions. All of you here are doing absolutely amazing, brilliant work. But, the projects that you're finding funding for, it's like a game of whack-a-mole, that game that we play nearly in every culture of some kind or another. And that's how I feel. That game always means that you're tired at the end of it. You never win because the moles keep popping up until the game sort of ends. And we're at the end game now. So what does that require? It means essentially requiring this community to be more political, to demand more systemic change, to really be more accepting that actually your role in continually focusing on funding and technical assistance and capacity building and calling resilience is maybe, not getting the message about how urgent and how big a systemic change that we need. So Paris, I negotiated, one of the things I followed in the negotiations was, well, obviously 1.5, but also loss and damage. And it's the first time that very clearly in any of the agreements you've got loss and damage. And that was an absolutely huge, politically important win for the demand. It's not a win to, be at that point where you get an article on loss and damage into a treaty. So all of us have negotiated this with such a deep level of sorrow to demand this. And why is that? It's because actually it isn't possible to just look at this any longer through the lens of mitigation and adaptation and disaster risk reduction and resilience. This is about the extinction of cultures and entire ecosystems in a very rapid time frame. And I think that's why the message that Extinction Rebellion and many others are using is more compelling. And it's certainly our young people are no longer accepting the kind of, excuse my language, bullshit that we've been selling, that we've got it, we're going to solve it, we're going to tax. The IMF today has said we need a $75 tax immediately on emissions. And I think, why didn't you say that 10 years ago, IMF? Why didn't we start 10 years ago? Why didn't you start 10 years ago to ask for dramatic solutions? So my message is one of activism and unifying the knowledge that you have with the feelings in your heart that we need to do something different, and that you need as professionals to speak up in your own way, in your own institution. So I worked also in philanthropy just down the road with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation for 3 years. And I look back at those 3 years and, money is always important, money is always needed. But month after month, we would defer or delay a decision. We would ask for more. We would ask for more information. We would sit and plan yet more scenarios. We would ask for more critical pathways. We would drive our, grantees insane, actually. And I feel like, the times come when the development community really has to get rid of the red tape and really hear and understand what's going on. As I said, I work for the Marshall Islands, and quite often they fall between the stools in terms of who's going to look after them from the big donors, because the French have their patch, Australia and New Zealand have their patch countries. The Marshall Islands isn't a Commonwealth country. We were thinking of applying. So these kinds of patterns are ridiculous. It's 2019. We really need to hear and support these countries as they go forward. I don't want to end on a bad note. Yesterday, it's actually the day before, the Marshall Islands Parliament, called the Nitijela, declared the country to be in a climate crisis. And if you go on Twitter and follow President Hilda Heine's Twitter feed, you can see a copy of the resolution. And that's actually the state that countries are in. The leaders of these countries are breaking down emotionally when they meet in public. What does that say about us? That we've become able to absorb that information and still act as if we still have a decade to fix this. We don't have a decade to fix this. I think we have less than a couple of years to make the dramatic changes, such as $75 carbon tax, and to expose the blockers of that kind of action. And that's why I glued myself to the headquarters of Shell in April and got arrested, because all of the evidence, I'm sorry to say, has shown that actually major emitting companies, especially the oil and gas companies, but also agribusiness, many others, have actually stopped climate action, have diluted, delayed, and deliberately obscured, and in many cases are still greenwashing, what they're doing. And we have to call that out. That's an objective fact. That's not a political thing anymore. You can go and read thousands of reports that say that. Many litigation cases are now uncovering papers which show that complicity. And the legal processes of accountability are slow, which is why you're seeing the street protests, because our justice systems, I think, will prevail in calling out and holding the systems that created that inertia to account. They will do that. I have absolutely no doubt that the legal systems will call out and hold major emitters, both countries and polluters, to account at this point. You cannot do anything but they take time, these processes, and that's why we need everyone to be much more active, much more joined up, much more courageous. So anytime somebody says we need more information, we can't do this, please take a moment to reflect and reach into that audacious leadership, which I'm encouraging you to tap into, and say, no, we need to do this now. Every time there's some more red tape, more requests for information, you know very well that many of these countries can no longer hire, and wait for a 12-month process. That's gone. It's over. So, as I said, I'm speaking very much from the heart, but I feel like I've worked in many different research institutes, government, with funders and philanthropy. And for me, every time you have a delay for 3 months, that's a quarter of the year gone. Every time you delay another project for 6 months or ask for it to go back to the drawing board, every time you think we still have to use the existing modalities, which mean that, you're not getting them the money out the door, the resources out the door, you're not really hearing the requests for sometimes small-scale things to happen very, very fast. Please reconsider that. And then finally, my last point is we do have to all become more political. That sadly, if you were a neutral, independent, technical person, which I was too, much love writing those sorts of reports, then speaking in this more emotional and direct way, it's because now words like ecocide, the destruction of nature, the whole-scale abuse of human rights, are what fit the facts. Those are the neutral words, and that's what everyone is hearing. And I would encourage you as development practitioners to raise your voice for the very reason that you entered this profession, to raise your voice, to build this kind of world. It needs to be built. You are absolutely crucial to that, and to act with urgency and haste. And thank you for letting me say that to you.
Farhana, thank you very much. Sense of urgency, your clear call to action for systemic change, and thank you very much for your activism and courage too. So I think our time, unfortunately, is up. It only remains for me to say thanks once again to you, the audience, to our speakers, to our panelists, to our co-hosts, and to my Devex colleagues for their work behind the scenes in making this event happen. We'll be continuing our Turning the Tide coverage on Devex.com. That's all from me here in London, and have a nice weekend ahead. Thank you.